Welcome to Mex Moves, the weekly podcast where Damien Fraser and I, Eduardo Garcia, break down the topics and headlines shaping Mexico's business and financial landscape. Damien, you look good. How are you doing?
Very well, thanks, Eduardo.
Good. This week we have a very interesting interview about informality in Mexico with Sofía Ramírez Aguilar. She's the head of the think tank México, Cómo Vamos. But before that, you and I, Damien, we will review a few topics like the Aeroméxico-Delta back on track deal, a little bit about the Canadian and the U.S. Quite serious rift on trade, Mexico's Banco de Mexico change of its GDP forecast, a little bit more optimistic, as well as a AI software company, Mexico Primero, raising capital, and a few other items. And I'll end up talking about satisfaction. So why don't you start, Damien, with the Aeroméxico-Delta announcement that they made recently?
Sure. So as some might have seen, on August the 20th, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in the U.S. vacated the Department of Transport order forcing Delta and Aeroméxico to unwind their joint venture. So as things currently stand, the joint venture between Delta and Aeroméxico continues. It didn't, in the ruling, it didn't say that the joint venture is good for competition, but what it did say is that the DOT, the Department of Transportation, hadn't done the necessary analytical work to justify killing it. So they basically graded their homework as a fail, and the DOT could go back and resubmit its homework and try to block this. But obviously, from Aeroméxico and Delta's point of view, it's good news that this joint venture can continue. It's more than a code share, right? Because Delta owns 20% of Aeroméxico. They coordinate schedules, fares, capacity. They do revenue management, and they share economics subject to certain conditions. So this is almost like a combined network where they then share revenue. So in a normal kind of code share, as I understand it, for the most part, you get to keep your passengers and they get to keep their passengers. And then you send passengers back and forth if you don't have the flight. But under this JV, you're basically pooling the passengers and sending them to one place to another, and you get to keep the same economics, whether they fly with you or whether they fly with the other airline, once your costs are deducted. It's interesting because at the same time, obviously, Mexico is facing its own competition issue, which is the possible merger between Volaris and Viva-Aerobus. That was announced, at the end of last year. So, you should expect something quite soon, I would think. And in fact, Volaris has called a shareholders meeting to submit various items related to this merger, should it be approved. Speaking to different people, the expectation is that it probably will go through. There's obviously a lot of political pressure from powerful interest groups for it to happen. If it does happen, the combined entity would have about 70% market share, which by any standards would be a competitive threat. Now, they will put some conditions if they do approve it. They will most likely require them to give away some slots in airports, especially Mexico City Airport, where there's a lot of pressure on slots. They probably have to manage two separate brands, kind of allegedly have two separate management groups. But at the end, if there's one company on the stock market and one company with respect to economic incentives, it's going to be very difficult, whatever conditions you put on it, for them not to operate according to those economic incentives, which is to maximize profits, which for the most part means cutting back capacity and raising fares on routes where it makes sense to do so from a profitability outlook. So we'll see what happens. I shouldn't prejudge it. It's also, I think, beyond the impact on the airline industry. It's going to be an important test for the new competition authority, because as we know, it was the independent competition authority was basically disbanded and put under the Ministry of Economy. So this will be the first kind of very public test of how it performs, which will send an important message, both internally and domestically, how properly independent it is, and how it is functioning in this new system. Now, one thing that might kind of give an argument to agreeing to this merger is that all the airlines, Aeroméxico, Volaris, Viva, have suffered from the Iran war-related oil hike. So you saw their second quarter numbers from a margin perspective quite badly affected by the increase in oil prices. Now, the issue there, especially at the beginning of the second quarter, was that a lot of the tickets were sold before the Iran conflict, or before it was clear that the Iran conflict and the impact on oil prices would go on for a long time. So prices didn't reflect the higher oil prices, but the airline bought the oil at the higher price. So they weren't able to raise prices in time. Now, in the second half of the year, in the conference calls with investors, and both Aeroméxico and Volaris, Viva is private, of course, said that they expect to, and that they are now hiking fares and will see their margins improve in the second half of the year, either because of these higher fares or because oil prices come down. But either way, they both pointed towards kind of improvement in the second part of the year. But I guess Viva and Volaris are going to say, the airline industry is in trouble. Our operating margins are 4 or 5%. Let us go ahead with this merger and slash operating costs, find synergies. And, they will say, of course, that they will, pass on those synergies to the end customer. And if they don't do that, they'll say, it's going to be really difficult for us to function as a going concern, although there's a lot of cash on their balance sheet. I don't think there are any issues about their viability at this point. Actually, Volaris, despite the decline in margin, saw its cash position go up in the second quarter.
Yeah, I wonder whether the good news that Aeroméxico received with the judgment, with the resolution in America's court, helps the Volaris Viva Aerobus case, because they will maintain this very tight relationship with Delta. But as we saw on the day of the announcement, the share price really went up about 13%. So the market took it positively. But as you just said, the situation with the airlines is not as promising as it is. And the share price of Aeroméxico is still like 26% below year to year. So it's a tough situation in which the airlines are currently facing. So good news, bad news in a certain way. There's still a lot of room. There's still a lot of time to see how everything evolves, whether Viva, Aerobus, and Volaris get the merger and under what conditions, and how does Aeroméxico adapt to that now that its alliance with Delta seems to be on safe grounds. So it's interesting what's happening in the airline industry, without a doubt.
It's probably not going to be a key factor in the decision that the competition authority makes, but at the margin, it's going to make it an easier argument for Volaris. Look, Delta, Aeroméxico can continue with their kind of monopoly. Why can't we have ours? As it were.
Exactly.
And I think that Aeroméxico is in an interesting situation about whether they lobby for or against this Volaris Viva tie-up. I mean, first of all, I don't think they're going to lobby. They're going to stay, a little bit removed from the whole issue, but sort of in private, as it were, whether they want it to happen or not. Because on the one hand, if they let it happen, they become the smaller player, which is for Aeroméxico will be quite unusual, maybe kind of uncomfortable, much smaller player, let's say, and that's not a good thing. On the other hand, the conditions attached to the merger may be very beneficial to Aeroméxico, namely freeing up slots in Mexico City. They're going to get more slots in the second half of the year, and they talked about that in their second quarter conference call. But if this merger happens, they're going to be able to get that pound of flesh. So in relative terms, they'll be much smaller, but in absolute terms, they might get some nice concessions, which will be helpful to them. So I think either way, Aeroméxico can be sort of satisfied with. If it doesn't go through, there's some pluses. If it does go through, then maybe the conditions will help it gain some market share. And of course, if it does go through, and if in the end, not on day one, but if in the end, Volaris and Viva-Volaris as a combined entity cut back some capacity and raise prices, become less competitive, that's also good for Aeroméxico because it takes away some of the pricing pressure. I mean, they say they're not competing, that they're full service, but in the end, most customers look at, how much is it going to cost me to fly to Monterey? I'm willing to pay 20% more for Aeroméxico because it's a bit more comfortable, it has Wi-Fi or whatever. But, I'm not willing to pay 40% more. So whatever they actually say, there is some pricing comparison between the airlines. And it's so easy now with all the kind of online apps that we have to compare one to the other. So I think even if they don't say it, Aeroméxico would probably benefit from this tie-up by just taking capacity out of the system.
And pricing pressures, like you said, which is the one that we don't like to hear, but that's inevitable if it happens. But anyway, shall we move along to the trade war between the U.S. and Canada, as Mark Caney described it after the two countries failed to reach an agreement last Friday?
Yeah, so I think most people probably would have followed the outbreak of the trade war after the breakdown of the talks on last Friday. The question now is, what does this mean? From a perhaps rather parochial perspective, what does this mean for Mexico? I think again you can play it different ways from my perspective, at least. I mean, on the negative side, which is how most people have taken it, it's like a trilateral agreement, which is what USMCA is, of course, is more difficult to achieve if the US and Canada are in a trade war. So clearly getting a kind of full three-way trade agreement is a bad thing. Secondly, I think it's bad because it shows that the US is willing to be kind of aggressive on certain items that might also be difficult for Mexico to countenance. So what were those items? According to reports in the Journal and the New York Times, the US wanted Canada to follow US tariffs on China, but not only the current tariffs, but any future tariffs that US may decide to impose. Secondly, the US didn't really want to be bound by the treaty in and of itself, so they sort of let themselves sort of put tariffs in the future against Canada if they so wished. So as Carney said, this is a treaty written with a pencil. And third, they wanted to keep tariffs on especially on heavy trucks, and which wasn't convenient to Canada, as I think Ford produces a lot of heavy and semi-heavy trucks out of Canada. So third, it's bad because it shows this divisions within the U.S. government. So Jameson Greer, the USTR rep, sort of reached a deal with Canada on sort of the Wednesday, and Trump announced it. And then Ludwig came in, the Commerce Secretary, and said, we shouldn't cede on the steel and the aluminium, the so-called 232 tariffs of 50%, and we should keep tariffs on the heavy trucks. So the Canadians sort of thought they had a deal with their main negotiator, Greer, and then Commerce got involved and it broke down. So that, Mexico's obviously going to face the same dynamic. I think that the positive, if you want to call it that, given that all those negatives are undoubtedly true, is one, the talks, from what I hear at least, the talks between Mexico and US are going pretty well, because Mexico is playing a very different strategy to Canada. So Mexico is being much more conciliatory. It didn't, when those 232 tariffs were put on steel and aluminium and some lumber as well, Mexico didn't retaliate, whereas Canada did. So secondly, Mexico doesn't seem to have a problem with one of the issues that was an issue for Canada, which is following US tariffs on China, or to be precise, on countries that Mexico doesn't have a free trade agreement with. So Mexico is a bit more compliant, if you want. And thirdly, maybe there's more pressure on the US to reach a deal with Mexico, given that the deal fell through with Canada, because ultimately these deals, if they fall through, raise inflation in the US, raise cost pressures in the US, and there's midterm elections, of course, in November. So does the US really want to have two deals that have failed, two cost pressures at the same time? And then maybe Trump has got his sort of pound of flesh from Canada, doesn't need it from Mexico, and then Mexico and the US are more complementary economies. Mexico being low cost, whereas Canada and the US, except for kind of certain products like oil, are relatively similar. So the US kind of needs Mexico to be competitive, or it doesn't perhaps really need it. It is an issue, all of this said, especially on cars, when there's a lot of trilateral trade. So these cars and car parks that are going backwards and forwards between Mexico, US, and Canada, if they're starting to pay big tariffs in Canada, makes the whole supply chain more complex, and maybe it's just easier to import the car from Asia or Europe, or just make it in the US full stop and leave Mexico out of the equation and Canada out of the equation. So there's also some complexity there. I mean, I think on Wednesday we all thought that, well, not all of us, but many of us thought that US and Canada had a deal. Then Friday they didn't. Then you had the tariffs that had been announced by the US imposed, and Canada's retaliatory tariffs, and then Trump saying he was going to put 50% on cars, but from January the 1st. So things can change very quickly, and maybe Canada and the US, tomorrow will reach a deal by the time you listen to this. And so it's difficult to predict what's going to happen, when things are so volatile. But what I'm hearing at least is that, a bilateral kind of deal is still very much on the cards, despite what happened in Canada. And how you get this to happen within a trilateral USMCA framework isn't that clear. But on the other hand, the legal niceties don't seem to matter to Trump, and probably don't matter to Mexico either. So, Trump has put these tariffs on the Section 232, the 122, the 301, the 338. Some of these tariff sections have never been used before, were last used in the 1930s. So maybe they'll have a side letter between Mexico and the US that, will, basically be a bilateral agreement within a trilateral, quote unquote, framework, because getting a new treaty through Congress is basically impossible at this point. So maybe there's a way they can make it happen, and, Mexico will sign off on any kind of bilateral sort of side letter that will, allegedly keep the USMCA together, but have different deals between US, Mexico, and US and Canada. And there won't be, even if Mexico and US get a deal, what's very, very clear, it'll be, it won't be a 16-year deal. It'll be, these annual reviews. So every year, they'll have to go back and do the same thing. Maybe it will be easier in the future than it seems to be this time around.
Yeah, I take a few conclusions from this fight between the U.S. and Canada. I agree with you with the negatives and the positives. Mexico, I think the negatives are pretty clear, and the positive is that it might make it easier for Mexico to reach an agreement with the U.S. as the U.S. might not like to have two people fighting with him on the ring at the same time. But now, having said that, I think it's quite. I also predicted that they will reach an agreement, Canada and the US. I think there is too much at stake for both countries. And some of the damage that the tariffs do is to American companies. So, I think it was Luis de la Calle, I heard him say that this is not, it doesn't make any sense at all when you hurt your own manufacturing companies because of the transaction that takes place between the two countries. So I hope they reach an agreement. Now, what I really like is that Canada has stood up to Trump. I think that's a good thing. And obviously, Canada can do it much more than Mexico. I looked at their fiscal situation. It's much more stronger. It's not even close to our weakness. So Canada could come up and have a program to help their own industry, their small and medium-sized companies, weather the problems that a breakdown in USMCA could have with the US. It has a AAA rating. Its fiscal deficit is 1.2 2% of GDP or something like that. Nothing to worry. I mean, it's deteriorated a little bit over the past few years. So they have the tools, and I appreciate that from Carney to taking a big gamble. Now, politically, I've also read a lot that he becomes very popular when he does this against America, and also Canada has a few cards to play. I haven't played the energy card that much, and they probably won't because of a lot of households depending on Canadian electricity and oil, and that would even probably hurt that industry at its own home territory. But they have cards, and they are going to retaliate probably, like Mexico did with Peña Nieto in states that hurt Trump, electorally speaking, with the midterm election coming. So that's why I think in the end they will probably reach an agreement. The matter of fact that Trump threatened those tariffs until January 1st of next year, Canada will put its own, I think, September the 8th. So they gave each other a few days of wiggle room so that they might be able to let the volume come down and reach an agreement. It doesn't look like that way right now because Carney's words have been very strong, and the Ontario province prime minister has also been very critical and very aggressively against Trump. But you never know. I mean, these are politicians, and they like to probably show certain victory. And for Mexico, I hope they do for these negatives that we talked about it, but that doesn't deter Mexico from reaching an agreement with the U.S. On a side parallel agreement, like you said. And I think the key element here, and I don't understand Canada's point of view. I think the key element here is that China is really a threat to the production capabilities of the West, if I may say so. That we should all bind together in trying to fix that in a way that is manageable for everybody, even from China. They've become a powerhouse in manufacturing. I was hearing the other day that they can produce all vehicles that Europe does now. So it's a real threat, and unless you deal with it in a very intelligent way and a united front, I don't think that will go away really easily. So I hope that Canada and the U.S. can see each other a little bit more eye to eye. I think Canada has used the China card more as a bargaining chip, but I hope that they can realize that that's where the focus should be in order to prevent China from really obliterating a lot of industries in the West, which is something that might happen in the end, but it should be done in an intelligent and cautious way and not in a very disruptive, all of a sudden type of occurrence. So we have to wait and see. It's an interesting thing. I wonder if the world had united against Trump in retaliatory fashion like Canada did, whether Trump would have sustained its policies, whether its protectionist group would be there. But we didn't do that. Canada did. So we'll have to wait and see how this whole mess turns out to be.
Should we move on to AI application of artificial intelligence in Mexican corporates? So there's two announcements over the last couple of weeks. One this week. Primero, AI announced a 12 million seed round led by General Catalyst, big US VC fund, and CASEC, maybe the biggest or most influential LATAM VC fund. And you've got some angel investors linked to FEMSA, Bimbo, Aeroméxico, Kimberly-Clark, also participating according to press release. And then Wonderful, founded in 2025, raised, not this year, raised back in March, $150 million with a $2 billion valuation. And they've landed in Mexico, and they did a press release with Mercado Libre Autos. They're helping Mercado Libre Autos, which is now competing with Kavak, of course, in deploying AI. Kavak, obviously, under Alejandro Massa, has been very vocal on how good it's using AI, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So we've got two of these. So what's the, as I understand it, what's the sort of point here is that a lot of companies have, obviously every company have all the AI tools, the ChatGPTs, the Claudes, the Perplexities, the Groks, but they're not applying it in a systematic kind of institutional way. And these platforms are going to help them do that. So according to Primero, they say that, there are roughly of mid and large companies, there are about 1,000 applications per organization, but only sort of 27% of them are connected to the AI models. So what they're doing is creating a kind of interface between all the company's data and all its existing software and the AI models, which will give it context, security, and help them run AI agents across all the different business lines that they have in a secure way, and linking all their existing data. And Wonderful also is basically helping companies deploy AI agents and reduce costs and identify new revenue opportunities. Interesting the contrast. So one is basically at the moment mostly Mexican, or they have an office in Madrid, but Jose Mario, Andres Rosales, Santiago Buena Hora, they're all, as far as I can tell, they're in their 20s. Jose Mario was, economics and computer science, Harvard. Andres was maths and physics, Harvard. Santiago, computer science, UPenn. So these are sort of young, 20-year-old sort of, Ivy League Mexican whiz kids or Colombian whiz kids. And whereas Wonderful, they've gone for a slightly different strategy. They've hired, top executives from Salesforce, and from ex-executives from Walmart, and more. So Phil Seabrook, who's the Mexico country head, was the CEO of Salesforce Mexico. Guillermo Güemes previously worked as CTO at Walmart, Bank, Banorte, Telmex, and so they're going for more of a slightly more traditional kind of senior executives who have good connectivity with some CTOs at large companies. I think there's so much room for every one of these companies, given how tough it is to properly implement AI agents across an organization that has very disparate data and existing software. So I think there's more than enough room for them, and probably another 50 so companies. Actually, we had on the podcast last year, if you remember, Eduardo Arkham, that does something similar. We had Sensai, that's more focused on CRMs for banks, but there's quite a lot of them, and they're raising money. They're raising money from very prestigious entities, and interesting to see how that develops.
Yeah, I liked it very much. That we in the 2021, 2022, we saw a lot of money coming into fintechs and those types of companies, and now Mexicans like Primero in this case developing an AI integrator, if I may say so, and that they are led by young Mexicans who are sparking the interest of quite well-known investment funds. So I think it's all good. Kimberly Clark, as far as I could read from the Primero press release and the news that came out of it, is already collaborating with Primero. So is SmartFit, Verde Bello, and even the Economic Development Ministry here in Mexico City. So I think if they can succeed in integrating all this data that these companies or institutions have, and AI becomes a tool for improving productivity, profitability, or even service to customers in the case of the Mexico City Development Economic Ministry, who is led by a very young woman as well, by the way. So I think the future is for them, Damien, and I'm happy to see that they're very well prepared from the resumes you just gave us. So it's very enthusiastic, or it's very inspiring that young guys are leading the way in the business world of Mexico. So kudos for them, and let's see how they develop their business model.
So moving on to growth, good news. Banco de Mexico, as you probably saw, Eduardo raised its forecast for 2026 from 1.1 to 1.5%. mainly because the economy, as we've already talked about, grew a stronger than expected 1.4% in the second quarter after a contraction in the first quarter. So that basically arithmetically automatically causes the full year forecast to go up. And then 2027 forecast basically unchanged at 2%. What's interesting is what's behind this growth. I mean, it's very much behind the increase in growth forecasts. A lot has been driven by exports, especially exports, as we've talked about, of computer equipment related to the boom in AI data centers and data centers in general in the US. And the July export numbers are pretty amazing coming out of Mexico. You're seeing on an unadjusted annual basis, Mexico's exports were $81 billion, up 44%. Electrical equipment exports rose 134%. So these are absolutely massive numbers. Now, of course, imports also grew very strongly because most of these stuff is imported from Taiwan or places like that. But still, there's clearly some value added being left in Mexico, and you're seeing that value added reflected in the GDP numbers and in the trade number, the overall trade surplus numbers, where Mexico is basically running a balanced trade, having always run a trade deficit. Now, because of we see these amazing numbers, and there isn't a lot of news. I think they deliberately keep quite a low profile on who's actually behind these exports to the US. I mean, so I did some digging, I have to say, mostly on AI, Claude in my case. But there's a big announcement actually this week. Pegatron is putting $330 million into Ciudad Juarez. Now, Pegatron is best known for making iPhones, but they're now, as well as making iPhones, pivoting to making stuff for data centers. So this is going to be both for technology for data centers and also electric mobility. I guess that's like electric cars. So that's one of the players behind this increase. The biggest is Foxconn. They actually had already announced $1 billion investment about a year ago. They're mainly in Jalisco, and they're going to be and they're investing a lot in buying up new land, hiring more people. They have tens and tens of thousands of employees. And then you've seen some other Inventec, Megasite made the investment in Chihuahua, $450 million over a number of years, they said in July, which would be 6,000 jobs. We win in November 2025, a $200 million capital increase for its Mexican business. Quanta, which is a Taiwanese company, is going through an AI sort of boom, AI server boom, and it's investing more in Mexico. And then there's Flex. So when I said, I actually made a mistake. When I talked about Foxconn, I meant to say Flex. They're the ones that announced the $1 billion investment in April 2026 to be deployed between 2026 to 2028. And Foxconn is a $241 million capital increase. So, and Flex, according to this, already has about 40,000 employees in Mexico, which would make it one of the largest companies by employees in the country. So I thought all of these data points are pretty interesting, that one can now easily get from all the LLMs that we will have access to.
It's very interesting that you mentioned a few Taiwanese companies. I think Taiwan has now become the third largest importer into Mexico, which was not really on the radar, but it seems like what you just mentioned is the key element, that the Taiwanese companies or Taiwanese products are coming into Mexico, getting a little bit of some local construction, manufacturing, or whatever, and then send up to the States, or using data centers that are building up here in Mexico. So the AI boom, I mean, we talked about Primero just a few minutes ago, about a Mexican company doing well with funds. Here we have another element where the AI boom is helping Mexico. We just saw Nvidia yesterday breaking every expectations on revenues, not so much on profitability, but doing very well. So I think it's a link of why the central bank rose its GDP and why Mexico did well. The forecast is still pretty grim for the third quarter and on, and a 1.5 or 1.8 growth percentage for Mexico is below its capacity. So I hope the authorities don't feel like this is where they should be happily rested. On the contrary, I hope they could continue or that are willing to think over what they're doing and what is not working and what needs to be changed for Mexico to grow at a faster rate. I mean, our demographic population bond, as it is called, is coming to an end, and we don't take advantage of it. We won't. So hopefully all these good news or upgrades in growth forecasts and things like that just entice them to be even more aggressive in trying to take Mexico to a next level. And I think that is also, or would be good for them in order to finance their social programs. I mean, I think the disconnect between a growth strategy and helping the poor doesn't need to be there. I mean, I think you could grow and still distribute wealth at the same time, and it's just a matter of understanding what markets want and what private capital wants to accomplish that, while at the same time funding what you want in terms of helping people's living standard rise. So should I, on that note, should I move into the satisfaction element that I have for this podcast?
I think that makes sense. Eduardo, tell us how satisfied you are.
Well, before I tell you about my satisfaction, let me just review a little bit of one quite interesting indicator that Mexico's INEGI puts out, and this week they came out with the latest number. It's an index of, shall I call it, well-being, or should I better say the Rolling Stone index in terms of the word satisfaction of getting it or not. Well, the index showed that Mexicans from age 18 and upward in urban areas, I must say, in a scale of 0 to 10, where 10 is obviously totally satisfied with life and 0 is no satisfaction at all, it has steadily grown since Mexico began tallying this indicator 13 years ago. The Mexican economy might not be growing or might be growing below its potential. The country's security issues might not have been solved since Peña Nieto to even currently, even though the homicide rate has been declining quite importantly. And even as informality grows, like what we will talk with Sofía later, despite all that, the satisfaction has grown among Mexico's population from a 7.67 grade, which is not bad at all, in 2013, to 8.72 this year. And that is the highest level of satisfaction achieved by that cohort of Mexico's population over the last 13 years. So despite everything Mexico has not accomplished, that hasn't stopped most Mexicans from growingly feeling good about themselves. Now, in 2024, the government expanded the scope of this indicator to include even younger Mexicans from 12 years upward, as well as rural dwellers. But even the indicator targeting a larger population swath, the levels of satisfaction are still pretty high. So for the larger number, for this larger number, the level of satisfaction in Mexico is 8.75, higher than 8.65 a year ago. Surprisingly, or maybe not, men indicate that they are slightly more satisfied with their lives than women, 8.83 for men versus 8.68 for women. And also, interestingly, and this is something to be taken into account, the younger the cohort they interviewed, the more satisfied they were with life, which is kind of understandable. as you get older, and I'm not talking about me, which is much older, but as you develop burdens that life shots at you, and then as your body starts failing, you are less satisfied with life. But the youngsters from age 12 to 17 are the ones that are really, really satisfied with life. 9.39 points versus 8.38 points for those 75 and older. It's not a big difference, if you ask me, Damien, but then again, an interesting result. Now, if you look at a more granular aspect of this indicator, there are some interesting elements of life and the satisfaction people have on them. For instance, the element of life where 12 and older Mexicans are less satisfied is obviously security. In that aspect, the grade was just almost at flunk level, 6.44 points. So that indicates that most Mexicans are still very unsatisfied with the way security is provided. On the contrary, the highest element of life where people feel the greatest satisfaction is the freedom to decide what to do with their lives. That was interesting. That element of life got a 9.18 grade, nearly 10. So people in Mexico are very much in tune with feeling free to do whatever they want. Family relations got a 9.0 grade, followed by satisfaction with the main activity that person interviewed does. So people are happy having family relations. People are having satisfaction doing what they do. That last one got an 8.78 grade. On the contrary, besides security, the other element that gives less satisfaction to Mexico is the status of the environment, which got 7.66 points. While their amount of free time is also some of the things that they feel less satisfied. So they are demanding more free time. That got 8.15 grade. And their life status got 8.4. So this is all below the average rate of life satisfaction in Mexico, which shows that there is room for improvement. But overall, I would say that we're all pretty satisfied in Mexico.
Just to finish off, because we're running out of time, Mario, I don't know if you remember Mario Molina, the Mexican Nobel laureate in chemistry. I think he won it back in 1995 when I just arrived in Mexico. As I remember it, he was interviewed by Jose Gutierrez Bilbao. Remember him, the radio host on Radio Red. And he said, like, what, you just won a Nobel Prize. You're one of the most distinguished chemists in the world. Like, why aren't you sort of teaching at Harvard or MIT or wherever? He was at the UNAM at that moment. And Mario Molina, I think, said, like, I've taught many times in US universities, but I can't live in a country where you can't do a U-turn in a motorway. So it's good. It's good to live in Mexico, the land of the free. It's not Texas, it's Mexico. So with that, let's move to our interview. Today on Mex Moves, we're joined by Sofía Ramírez Aguilar. Sofía is the Director General of México-Cómo Vamos, one of Mexico's leading economic think tanks. How are you today, Sofía?
I am very good. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. So, México-Cómo Vamos recently published a report on Mexico's labor market and informality within the labor market. And today's conversation is going to focus mostly on that, even though México-Cómo Vamos covers the broader Mexican economy. So, Sofía, maybe we could just start off by sharing with us and with our listeners that might not have had the chance to read the report, what were your main sort of findings, conclusions, what you found surprising, or what other people might find surprising from the work that you put into better understanding Mexico's labor market?
Of course. So first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that the informality within the labor market in Mexico is a rule. So having said so, just to put some figures out there, I would like to mention that more than 55% of people who work in Mexico has an informal work. That means that they own a job in which they don't get any social security at all. And probably they're not even having any legal recognition of this job. So problematic is not only that, but also that it adds up to 25% of Mexican GDP, all in all, the informal economy. So that means that even though it's more than half of the population working within the informality, it's only 1/4 of the economy being produced within this informality. So the thing is, we are quite unproductive, and we are leaving more than half of the working population in a very, unjust position in terms of access to social security. Having said so, I'd like to also mention that if we compare that to the figures in the US and Canada, of course, we're going to have major differences. For example, in the US, the share of informal economy out of the GDP is just 2%, and in Canada it adds up to 2.7%. So that's a huge difference if you compare that to the 25 GDP points that you find in Mexico. Also, if you just talk about informal employment in Canada and the US, you come down to 8% of people working in such a position. That means that it's not only a thing of having less oversight on who works where, but also it's a major problem for productivity, as you may be aware from the figures I already mentioned. But also, it's also a problem of coverage of social services, social security, access to healthcare, and so on. So what we are developing here is the third edition of this report, in which we acknowledge this, what I've already showed you, but also we take a peek into some other topics. For example, the composition of microenterprises in Mexico is not that different as in countries such as the US and Canada. More than 95% of all enterprises are microenterprises. The difference is that in Mexico, almost 70% of microenterprises belong to this gig economy, to this informal economy, and are not informal because they want to be avoiding to pay taxes, but because they are on the survival mode. Those are enterprises that are not meant to be firms or startups, but it's people that actually didn't find a possibility to get a job in some other bigger firm with some more economic stability and therefore more productivity. I think it's also important to mention that the informality is not equal through the Mexican economy. There are several, and I think this is important to acknowledge, there are several big enterprises and governmental institutions that are hiring people within a certain type of informality, mostly as contractors, but that means also that they are avoiding to comply with the Mexican law in terms of labor. So those are some of the major results we find, and also we took a peek into differences by sex, of course, differences on income, and differences in topics such as how many children do people have to have in order to be able to have or be more prone to own a formal job. So those are some of the results, and happy to talk about some of them.
So why do you think it's been so difficult to reduce informality, given that it's associated with negative productivity, associated with limited or non-existent safety net for the people in the informal sector? What has caused the lack of progress on that front? Because I've seen the 55% figure stay at those levels for, maybe for decades now. I've seen very little change in it, at least.
Yeah, you're right. I think it comes back to at least three topics. First of all, is the lack of rule of law and the lack of oversight. I mean, if you have institutions, public institutions or authorities that are not able to overlook who's paying what to whom and who's working where, it will be more difficult to oversee informality within small and medium enterprises, of course, but also big enterprises. Nonetheless, it's not the majority of the people who are within an informal job or working in the informality that belong to SMEs or big enterprises. As I said, it's mostly micro enterprises. So I go back to the basics. What is the cause? Well, I think part of the problem is we are lacking a capability of growing. And I know we're not focusing on this conversation in investment and some other microeconomic figures, but I'd like just to leave this idea on the table, which is if we do not talk about the need to increase investment and productivity, our economy is just going to keep on stagnant in improving this figure of 55% of people working within informality. And I think last but not least, we are having a problem in including women within the labor market, the paid labor market. And I think this is also an important topic because Mexicans, as well as any other society around the world, mostly are having less children than ever before. So even though we are in comparison a younger society or a younger economy than our North American peers, Canada and the US, of course, we are having less children, and that means that we have the opportunity to keep up with our potential growth if we include more women within the labor market. So we have the most educated generation of young people, mostly young women. Since the last decade, more or less, we've been also watching that women are more educated in terms of formal education than their male peers. And I think that opens the question, why are female workers, or why are women working in so low rates in comparison to other Latin American economies, not even comparing ourselves with some other cultural differences? So I think that goes back, of course, yes, to a cultural thing, but not mostly, because if you take a peek into how much Mexican-born women work, for example, in the US, you get a share of that population of around 53% of all women in labor age. That means 15 years and older of Mexican-born women in the US working or seeking for a job. In Mexico, it's around 46%, that percentage. That means that, of course, there is a cultural component, but that's not mostly what's happening. So what we need to take into account is how to incorporate within our cultural particularities affordable childcare and, of course, also elderly care, because as any other population, which is not getting younger but older, we are needing to have this conversation on who's taking care of older people and how to get into an economic logic, into a market, that labor, which is right away being done by mostly women and not paid for. So I think those are the three reasons why informality is still so high and stagnant in Mexico. Again, it's lack of oversight / rule of law. It's lack of growth, and that, of course, implies low investment. And number three is the partial or the incomplete labor participation of women.
Sofía, that's quite interesting. Let me go back a little bit. Since we're talking about the informal sector, how confident or how do you measure the informality? If you can tell us a little bit of the challenges you face with the methodology to bring these numbers to the forefront.
Of course. We're not developing a a methodology ourselves. We're just taking the international methodology of the World Labor Organization, which goes back to the very basics. And it means that it's the lack of acknowledgement of a contract and the lack of social security services. Of course, you can say that there are different versions of this informality, and in Mexico we already have 4 different characterizations, like in the broader picture. We're going to talk about that in a bit, but I think that makes it comparable to some other economies, such as Brazil and Colombia, for example. And I think part of the problem that the Mexican economy has such a high labor informality is that we are not necessarily approaching a more productive economy. And that goes back also to the trade arena, because we've seen that the manufacturing sector, which is very integrated to the supply chains of North America, is still one of those big employers which offer formal jobs and higher income, because that's another point. Informality pays on average half of what formal jobs pay in Mexico. So back to the international comparison, it's important to acknowledge that in Mexico, we're very happy with some of our figures, because we are proud and tell that we have the lowest unemployment rate in the world, or one of the lowest, which is less than 3% of the labor force. But that implies necessarily that there are a lot of people working within the informality, that they don't have access to unemployment insurance or some other income sources, and therefore they really need to keep on working. And that means that people are just willing to go out and do whatever economic activity is available out there. And that doesn't mean that they are working within a proper job and so on. So I would leave it over there with this answer to your comment, and hopefully we come back to the differences within informality that we are seeing here in Mexico.
No, thanks. So we'll get back to that. But before we do, there is a myth in Mexico that people like to be in the informal sector because they don't pay taxes and it's easy, they have more flexibility. But the figures you just told us in terms of what percentage of the economic activity population versus their input into the GDP is outstanding. People are not making a good living out of the informal activities that they do. So it's not that they don't want to be in the formal sector. It's more like there are no opportunities in the formal sector. Is that how you would perceive the problem?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is, you probably nail it with the point, because a lot of people think that people choose to work within informality, and that might be the case for some few cases, but most of the population who works in some type of informality, again, has a very low income. And women, for example, in most of the cases, they face lower income by any classification. I mean, if they work in the agro sector, or if they work in household labor, or in the informal sector, because it's not the same to work within the informality than to work within the informal sector, because again, 55% of the population work within the informality labor market, but the informal sector employs around 30% of people. So people who work in the informal sector, if you're a woman, you're still earning pretty much half of what a man earns within the informal sector. So that's one of the cleavages that is most important, that a lot of women who work within the informal sector or within any other informality, they don't get to add up 8 hours straight a day to work, like a shift, a complete shift. That means that they have 2 hours in the morning and then 2 hours around noon and then 6 hours in the afternoon. And then they can get to sell stuff or to do some other activities that allow them to have any kind of income. That doesn't mean that they're not working, because they do. And the surveys that are made in households, and this is the income we use for the analysis, and it's comparable around the world, show us that a lot of the people who work within informality are not able to have those complete shifts of 8 hours straight to be able to apply to a formal job. So on the one hand, there is a lack of proper transportation, which adds up some time to go to the city or to the working centers that are prohibiting people to apply to those jobs. But on the other hand, there are a lot of people who would be willing to work more hours, and they just cannot find the working offer that they're looking for. So I would say that the myth that the people really are looking for an informal job, it's just a myth. Again, of course, not in all cases, but in most of the cases. And if you think about how much a Mexican worker earns, it's around $900 with the current exchange rate. Yeah, thank you. If you work within the formality, but if you work within the informality, you are earning less than $500 so a month. So the difference is huge. And if you're a man, you're mostly going to add up some more money, even if you work within the informality, because of two reasons. Because men tend to have more time together to add up to a shift and hours just to work in whatever job is available. But on the other hand, because if you see why the labor income of informality has been growing, we need to go back to the increases in minimum wages since 2019, which are being accounted on for the formal jobs around 25% from 2019 to 2026. And they have this effect on increasing the informal labor income in around 30 percentage points for those who work in the informal sector. So what I'm trying to say here is there has been an important impact on the informal labor market by the increases in the minimum wage and in all in the labor market income structure that have been happening through the last 8 years that need to be addressed. But that's still not enough, because the pay gaps have been there and are going to be there until we address growth by more investment, affordable care, and of course the integration of women to the labor market.
On the last part of your answer, Sofia, have you seen that the increase in the minimum wage, which was needed, and we're all mostly in favor of it, but has it reached a point that it's pushing people out of the formal sector to the informal sector?
I think we are reaching probably that point, but that wouldn't be a topic if we would be facing a more dynamic economy. And of course, if we would be facing a bigger pace in the integration of supply chains in North America, which right now is not what we're seeing all across the region, but just between Mexico and the US. I mean, Canada and Mexico have been having talks recently the last trimesters, but still, I mean, the US territory is still in the middle, and Canada and Mexico are far away from each other. So I think this is a major topic, because we've been investing in this regional integration for the last 40 years, and for the last 2 years or year and a half, that integration has been not damaged, and of course put into a big question mark. So I think it's also important to acknowledge that if we don't try to wrap up around those sectors that allow Mexico to have more integration to the global supply chains, but also to try to attract more investment so that we get much more productive and therefore our economy grows, we're not going to be able to have a faster pace in which we diminish or lower the rate of informality in the labor market. So I think it's very important to acknowledge that formality is very much linked to growth and much more to integration of global supply chains, and much less it's the thing or the topic of minimum wages into the discussion. I don't want to say that the minimum wages are not relevant, of course, but it's not in the center of the discussion. There are some other topics that need to be addressed within Mexico, such as the Amparo Grid reform or the rule of law, the reform to the judicial system, and so on, that are affecting the formal enterprises, SMEs mostly, more than the increases in the minimum wage.
I mean, from my perspective, and I run a small company, one of the issues that business people face is the gap between what people receive in the formal sector, their net pay, and what it costs the company to employ them. The gap is partly driven by Social Security contributions, and those contributions no doubt rightly have gone up under the 2021 Afore reform, which increased the company's contribution to, I think, like 11% or so in 2030. And also the tax that the worker pays. Now, Santiago Levy and no doubt other economists have said, well, what we should do is separate the benefits that people receive from the job that they have, basically attach the Social Security to the person and not the company. And if you did that, you would reduce this gap between what it costs to hire someone and what that person receives, and therefore the incentives to skirt the laws would be much less. What's your view on, the theory behind that and the practice behind that? And do you think that perhaps unintentionally, the AMLO administration and the Sheinbaum administration has actually made it more difficult to get people into the formal labor market by widening that gap between what it costs to hire someone and what that person pays?
Well, I think that's more a question to you, because you are the one who's facing as an enterpriser or as a person, of a business person who's actually facing that amount of costs. But I think it's important to acknowledge that we were putting a lot of pressure into the workforce for so many people within the labor market, even though they were in the formal sector. I think, again, it would be so much more easier for the companies, mostly SMEs, to comply to the increases in those, like extra taxes and additional costs of formality that have been happening for the last 8 years, if we were facing a more business-prone environment. And I think that goes back also to some other extra taxation that the SMEs are facing, for example, extortion, both from authorities because of corruption and, on the other hand, from organized crime, even though you never know if it's a bigger cell of organized crime or a smaller one, and actually nobody wants to figure it out. They just want to, left alone and keep on doing their businesses. So I think it's also important to talk about those other costs, because if you just focus on like the costs of Social Security, you are actually just putting the pressure on an agenda that's not going to go back, because it's popular, because it's important, and because it has also allowed to increase the labor income of the informal, the people who work within the informality. So having said so, I think we need to pressure, on the other hand, we need to pressure on having more access to mechanisms to defend ourselves as businesses from the state in the sense of the Amparo grid, for example, and in that other topic of how to lower the costs of having an SME, which might go back to basic public security and diminish of extortion, which are, well, most of the conversations that I hear around Coparmex and CCE and some other business organizations in Mexico. So I think it's not irrelevant. It's not only the minimum wage, it's the lack of growth of the integration of North America, the uncertainty that goes back to the lines of production within the car industry, which is still very important for all three economies, Canadian, Mexican, and US economies, and labor markets. But it's also a fact of attending rule of law. If you go back to this survey of Banco de Mexico, which is the Mexican central bank, that is done and published every month, you see that rule of law and insecurity problems are the ones that are constant through time. You can see that, of course, the last couple of years, the international trade agenda has been growing as a major topic and a threat for Mexican economy's growth. But I think what lasts over time and is very consistent goes back to security topics and to rule of law issues. And those are some of the, topics within the Mexican agenda that need to be addressed and need to be, demanded to the government and not allow the government just to, sneak out through the Trump agenda conversation kind of thing. I think we need to go back to what's on our hands. And of course, that goes around trade, and we need to diversify our exports with some other trading partners and so on. But we need to take a peek into what's really important for the local economy. And that goes back to security, to rule of law, to corruption and extortion.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone would be in favor of that. But at the same time, I think people also say that it might be a good idea to have specific policies that reduce the incentives for informal employment. And what Levy has said, if I recall correctly, is to have a universal social security financed out of VAT, and that would reduce this wedge between the cost of a formal employment and informal employment. I'm taking it from your answer that you're not that keen on an idea of that nature, but are there any specific labor market reforms that you would like to propose that would help reduce the incentives to hire people informally?
No, I actually really like very much the proposal of Santiago Levy regarding that proposition. I think the problem is how to finance that. Because it's very unpopular to have an increase in the VAT tax, the IVA in Mexican terms, which would be the reasonable answer to how to finance and universal coverage, healthcare coverage for every Mexican. But I think the Mexican government has been transitioning into that, not the right way, if you ask me, in terms of making that spaces of exchange on how everybody's going to be able to attend themselves for health issues within the Instituto Mexicano de Seguro Social. But then the Hacienda, the finance ministry, is going to sum up and add up and do the math around who's paying for what. But I think that's at least is the right direction in that sense. I think more than labor particular policy, I would recommend the government, if they would ask me directly, to actually integrate an economic agenda that complies, on the one hand, the taxation and, of course, the revenue income from taxes on the one hand, but on the other hand, one that addresses the opening and existential threat to the SMEs, which comes back to extortion and so on. And then a third window that goes back to trade and how to integrate, the SMEs to the global supply chains, and then probably add up the labor agenda within that economic agenda, which I don't think this is actually happening. You see, on the one hand, the labor ministry just talking about increases in minimum wages without taking into account that the situation within growth is not doing well. And then you have a taxation authority just looking into revenues and winning prizes internationally for having such a good taxation policy, but not taking into account that they're choking probably some of the SMEs and some also of the bigger enterprises with that policy. And I think the lack of that integrated economic policy is actually hurting more the economy at the micro level that what's actually evident, because as long as the economy doesn't grow, there won't be a possibility for enterprises to grow, SMEs to become big enterprises or firms, and to integrate themselves within the global supply chains, and therefore to comply with some of the most important rules, which are going back also to the labor market. And I think there is not just one bullet to resolve the whole informality problem. We need to address it as a system. And of course, informality is more prone to happen within developing economies or emerging economies. But we need to take into account that we are facing informality within all 20 economic sectors. We're facing informality within all decile income decile distribution, and we're facing informality pretty much across any economic activity. And how that informality faces the challenges of the overview of the authority is quite a different conversation. But I think we cannot just say that it's a problem of universal healthcare, because that goes back more to how the economy is not growing to their biggest potential. And again, I know this is not the topic of the conversation, but we need to address trade policy and, of course, the capability of attracting investment. And then we would need to have the conversation on how to close the gaps and how to close those backdoors in which informality allows the Mexican economy to be so fluid.
Sofia, time is running out, but I want you to give you the chance of addressing the issue about different types of informality that we left on the drawing board. So if you can address that, that would be great.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that. I think it's important to talk about those 4 types of informality very rapidly. I mentioned that we have the informal sector, which are mostly people working within those existential threatening units, economic units, which are just surviving economic units. And they are probably just willing, those are people just willing to work for somebody else that they can't find a job that suits them. That's 30% of the population, ballpark figures. There is also this informal employment within firms, formal firms, governments, and some other international institutions, which accounts for 13% of the working population. I mean, that's still high and quite a lot. And you could say, well, those are contractors and those are not necessarily within the informal economy, I know, but they're still lacking access to social security and healthcare access through their work or their job position. There is, on the 3rd place, almost 9% of the population that work in Mexico within the agro sector that are still working within this informality. And the amount of people working in the agro sector has been lowering through the last 20 years. from 14% to almost 9%. And of course, that goes through the technification of the agro, but also it goes back to less people or less young people working within that sector, and that's okay. And then there's the fourth group of people that work within informality. It's less than 4% of the population, but this paid domestic labor. And that's the most difficult group of people who you can add up to formality, because they work alone at home in the anonymity of households, and they are very vulnerable to not getting their labor rights on track, because they really don't have like a network, and it's not that visible. So having said so, it's also important to acknowledge, and that's my last comment, that the formal labor has been growing faster than the growth of the population that goes within the people that are 15 and older, and then therefore in the group of working age people for the last 20 years. But if you acknowledge just for the post-pandemic era, from the 2020 or 2021 to nowadays, we see the informal sector within, like the informal sector within all the labor informality, growing faster than the population that is 15 years and older, but also faster than the formal labor market. And that's very, very worrying, because at the very end, those are, again, people who are mostly not being able to find labor or working position in any other place. And you don't want a whole generation of younger people adding up to the labor market that are starting their labor history within such a vulnerable position, because we also have documentation on that. You go on in and out of informality, but if you start early going into a formal job, you're going probably to stay more of the labor time or your labor life within formality. And if the longer you stay in the informal labor market, you are probably not going to be able to jump into the formality at any given moment with that much of a probability. So therefore, it's very important that we take a peek into that, because if we do nothing, we're going to also lose a complete generation of people that are not going to be able to contribute to their social security, and of course to have access to healthcare. Well, not a very optimistic note to close, but I think it's very important that we talk about that.
Oh, thank you, Sofia. It's a big challenge for the country, without a doubt, and it needs to be addressed somehow or another to reduce that threat that a generation faces if we don't do something about it. But we've run out of time. Thank you, Sofia. It's been very illustrative to learn more about this huge challenge that Mexico faces. So we hope to have you back and continue our discussions about this huge issue for the Mexican economy and the future of the country.
We need to keep on talking about AI and its impact on the informality later on. But thank you very much for having me, and it has been a lot of fun.
Thank you very much for joining Next Moves, and I hope you join us next week and follow us and review us.